So what was your take on the exam? You're saying it's a seminal exam, it's an important exam. Like why? Break that up.
There's a few things going on. One is there are some really challenging questions in really interesting ways, stuff that people haven't necessarily seen before. We might get into it a bit later on, but there's that classic question 39 in exam one that people have been talking about with the Hungarian algorithm, and it will raise a more philosophical question around the use of UDFs on the CAS calculator. So maybe ask me about that in a little bit later, because there's a whole conversation there. There's some really interesting questions around precedence tables. I would say the easy questions of the paper were easy, but the hard ones are really hard. It covers a lot of the main skills that us as teachers and students have been looking at over the years, but it also takes a lot of them further as well.
And the examiner's report has been out for a while now as well. What did that reveal about the exam in terms of what you've just shared there? Was that coming through in a lot of the commentary as well that was provided in the report?
Yeah. So the exam one report, one of the things they highlighted was how questions that required multiple steps of working were often quite prevalent in the exam and where students struggled. And that's a sign that the exams are starting to test not just your basic skill, can you do it, but can you apply it in multiple steps? And then the exam two, we'll go into like specific questions because I think that's where the students will be most interested. But just generally speaking, just some of the classic things that they want to emphasize. They're emphasizing again, you're seeing every time they're talking about bringing a ruler to draw your graphs, your significant figures, rounding errors.
Let's dig into exam one then.
So I've got my paper in front of me, but you've got your classic ones of reading off a segmented bar chart, analyzing a box plot, looking at a regression line and transformation. There are some pretty classic ones, in fact, I would say it has most of the classic ones. But then it can start to get really tricky. We'll go straight to the hardest one. The hardest one is this Hungarian algorithm one, which is the UDF question that I was talking about. And just to give you a sense of it, you've got your workings over here, you've got multiple pages, you've got different options there, lots of tables you can write and cross off. And the question essentially required students, if you were doing it by hand, to apply the Hungarian algorithm twice under two different situations. And the question by hand takes about 10 minutes to do. But there's something called a UDF, which is a user-defined function on the CAS. And maybe this is the beginning of my campaign to get Visa to ban them, because with the UDF on the CAS, it takes you 1 minute to solve. So that's essentially something that students would download to their CAS beforehand and then get used to using and then be able to apply it in the exam. Some teachers talk about UDFs as being the solution to everything. It's not going to solve you every question on the exam, but in this specific question, it could have saved you 10 minutes, which would have then helped you do other ones as well. And my campaign to VCA is that it's unfair. It's, students that have this essentially are advantaged and students that don't have it are disadvantaged. And it's not just on the general maths exam as well. On the specialist exam, there was a question with 8 marks that you could have done a UDF with. And it's really, I think, an unfair game changer. So my message to students is let's all just make sure we get it and start using it to eventually force VCA to change it. Well, specifically this Hungarian algorithm, if you ever have a Hungarian algorithm, that UDF works. So there's a UDF for different jobs. Any job you want to do, you could technically write a UDF for, but there are UDFs for other ones as well. Now, specifically this Hungarian algorithm, some students might be a bit worried about, do I need it? Do I have to use it? I did find another way to do this question using like a shortcut method of mine that takes maybe 2 minutes rather than the 1 minute. And so at our lecture at the end of the year, I can show students that if you like. So there are always ways around it. I'm not saying that these UDFs are the only way, and for most of the questions, there's always like a trick. But for some people, the trick is that UDF, and it can definitely save them a lot of time. There were a few questions that were sort of, we get into the habit of saying, general maths doesn't need any algebra. But there were a few questions finding, they said they gave you an average, you had to find one of the terms that made the average. And being able to do not complex algebra, year 9, year 10 algebra level, just setting up an equation with an x in it and then possibly solving it, using the calculator, if definitely using the CAS, but just setting up in the first place, it was needed. It's probably worth saying that when we say this, we are talking about really the 10% of the exam. It's always the case that 90% of the exam, if you've done enough practice papers, is stuff that you've seen before. Definitely, if it's the first time you've seen it, then you'd say, it is quite advanced in my thinking. But if you've done 15, 20, 30, 40 papers already, then 90% of the exam you'll know how to do. And so when we're saying these advanced skills and really understanding the maths and the reasoning behind it, that's talking to the body of students that want to really excel and get not just 90%, but go to 100% of the exam.
So essentially, if you're looking to really get a perfect study score or as close as possible, they're the questions that VCAA is using to really differentiate, aren't they?
Yeah. A score in the 40s. If you're really looking to excel, and I imagine a lot of the students watching this video are looking to do their best, then I would say those are the questions and those are the skills you really want to focus on.
And also understanding the why, as you said, really.
And I was going to say, actually, make a little plug that I think the Edrolo videos are really good at that. I make a good attempt at explaining the why, and the thing that I really enjoy in teaching the maths is not just the how do you do it, but why does it make sense? And I think as a student throughout the year, you're doing a process, you're learning the skill, practice the skill, get used to it, but always ask yourself, why is this the case?
Perfect. Shall we shift now to exam 2?
Let's go to exam 2.
Yeah, what were the big takeaways from exam 2?
Exam 2 had a lot of the stuff that we've seen before, So we have interpreting a residual plot. We have drawing a box plot. We have flicking through the time series, residual plot, final payment, showing calculations using recurrence. There was a nice little drawing the directed network from a Leslie matrix. That's new to the course, but that's quite enjoyable if you've practiced it. But there was also your classic final networks question with crashing, where you have to reduce the completion times for the minimum cost possible. And if you wanted to give a go at that question, there's lots of workings you can do to try and get your head around it. So a lot of things that we've seen before, and in terms of a practice exam, I think teachers will quite enjoy giving this to students to do. But there were tricks along the way. There was one question that only 3% of the state got. And I actually made that mistake as well. It's talking about a box plot, and it's saying, it asked how many values could appear inside this whisker over here. And I don't know whether students want spoilers or not. So
I think go there. They can skip this part if they don't want to, skip ahead 2 minutes.
Okay, well, basically, I'll just talk it through. Why not? Now, let's say there was just roughly 20 values in total. So they say how many values could be in this whisker over here? And you'd think that whisker is a quarter of the box plot. So you might say a quarter of 20 is 5. So you might say there are 5 values in here. But actually, you could have had all 4 values in this boundary, 4 values in this line, and only 1 point over here. So actually, the lowest number of points could have been just 1 point in that entire whisker. So that's the one that only 3% got right.
That's a tricky question.
Very tricky question. And it's a box plot one, which we often think is quite easy. And it happened early in the paper, but it was a tricky one.
What you hinted at some of the questions that were easy to make mistakes on. And you yourself made some mistakes on, which it's not giving students a lot of encouragement right now.
Well, I wondered how I'd talk about this, right? Because I sit the paper, and I'm here presenting, I'm an expert on the exams, maybe, and you want to be able to come along and say I got 100% on the paper, right? But I didn't, and I think it's worth me acknowledging that and showing that, because often students will say, "Oh, I made a bunch of silly mistakes," and I hear students sort of brush that away. I made some silly mistakes in their practice, and I always say, "There's no such thing as a silly mistake. You got to become friends with your silly mistakes." So in the spirit. Let me go through and tell you what my silly mistakes were. One.
This is exam 2 we're talking about still.
This is my exam 2. Draw the box plot in full. I didn't draw my whisker far enough. There you go. And some of these are silly and some of these are conceptual. Another one was this box plot. How many values will lie in that bottom whisker? I made a note to myself that 0.4% as an annual percentage rate doesn't necessarily make sense. It's a bit too small. That was a clue that I forgot to times by. Final payment, there were 2 options for your final payment, and I missed the word slightly in the question. They said the answer is slightly different to this other value. And in other words, I had to pick the one that was quite close, not the one that was quite far. So
which question was that? Which number is that?
It was the final payment question of question 8. Question 8, 2 marks. I actually wrote down both options and never write down 2 options because VCAA won't accept them both. Then I selected the one that I wanted. I crossed out the one I didn't and I selected the one that I wanted. And the one that I crossed out was the one that was correct. It was the one that was slightly different.
Which is so interesting, right? Like it really highlights why that reading time is so important. Because I've heard other people suggest, like, as you're reading, look for those keywords, look for any measurement, any key kind of words that maybe stand out.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that time where you can give yourself permission to like think about and ponder. So definitely, so I actually set this paper without reading time, which, you know, I again, students, I recommend you do it with reading time. Edrolo's not paying me by the hour, so I'm trying to do it quickly. That's a joke. And but basically practice reading time, because reading time is a skill in of itself. You know, it's what is it? It's like 1/6 of the entire writing time of the paper. I hope that calculation's right. I think it is. And so it's worth practicing how to do it. And so if I'd used it, I would have gone to that question. I would have said, hang on, which one do they want? Do they want this payment or that payment? And then maybe I would have seen the word slightly there. So there you go. And then look for the cut that crosses. So in the minimum cut, sometimes when you're searching for the minimum cut in the network, you've got to look for the one that crosses across the network. And that's often the one they're looking for. But sort of just on that, I want to use that as an example to sort of emphasize how important it is to make friends with the silly mistakes. And every time you do a practice paper, just like make a list and write them down and become really familiar with them. I think of sitting an exam like playing an AFL grand final. And what I would say is like what I did today, what I did yesterday is I went and I played a grand final without any preseason. And even a teacher that knows all the content, you can still make errors along the way. You know, with a lot of experience, with like a bunch of years of teaching experience, you could say just like the players that are like 30 years old, maybe their preseason doesn't need to be as long as everyone else's. Like in year 12, students, your current preseason is the entirety of year 12. For me, I would still need a preseason of like a month or two of sitting practice papers and writing lists like this to sort of start reminding myself of what are my common errors to then look out for them in the future. So everyone needs a preseason. Start yours as soon as you can.
It's a great reminder about the practice, right, as well, and why it's so important to be doing the practice, the questions on Edrolo or the practice questions in practice exams regularly and consistently throughout the year. And we've seen this in data where we've looked at the top achieving students. It's really regular because you need the time to build that up. I think students might be tempted to fall in the trap of, I'll do all that later, I'll do all that at the end, I'll do all that the few weeks before. But actually what you're saying is that preseason is your whole year. Use that time to practice because you'll build up those muscles in a sense.
Yeah, 100%. You know, and the questions we do from a textbook are seeing if we can do the basic skills, you know, and they're getting us a sense and understanding of what's going on. But if you want to do really well in an exam, a lot of the exam is assessing not just can you do the basic skill, but can you apply it in a different way? Can you do it in 2 or 3 different steps? And so I think the more we can practice that, and especially after an exam like last year, the more we can give our students those kinds of questions throughout the year, the more we're going to benefit them. Yeah.